Hi, everybody, and welcome to another segment of AstrologyAnswers.com's weekly forecast. My name is Terence. The week begins on Monday, April the 10th, 2023. The moon will be in outgoing, friendly, adventurous Sagittarius. The moon in Sagittarius, what sets the public tone, is more uplifting, more optimistic. A great sign for the moon to be in to start a new work week. In fact, during the day, the sun will be in fiery Aries, in harmony with fiery moon in Sagittarius. So when the sun and the moon are in harmony, it really helps get through any troubled times when things seem to be able to work out or find a solution. And by early evening, Pacific Daylight Time, the moon will then be in harmony with Jupiter. In fact, Jupiter is the ruling planet of Sagittarius. So this moon in Sag in harmony with Jupiter, the ruler of Sag, early evening is a really excellent time for feeling optimistic, making long-range plans, or maybe headed for the airport and getting on a red eye. On Tuesday, the moon continues in Sagittarius, but will be void of course from 3:48 a.m. until 10:33 a.m. Pacific time. As I mention every week, the moon void of course, the moon is no longer making any aspects to other planets until it changes signs. After Sagittarius, it goes into Capricorn. Sagittarius is really outgoing. Capricorn is much more subdued and conservative. But when the moon is void of course, just stick to the routine. Best not to introduce anything important new. Now also, after the moon goes into Capricorn and the energy is moving more forwards, more productively, the sun in Aries will be putting a spotlight on expansive, lucky Jupiter in Aries. So once a year, when the sun shines on Jupiter, it's an overall day of luck, of optimism. All things Jupiter come into the spotlight: traveling, education, publishing, marketing, teaching. Overall, Sun Jupiter is just a very upbeat, optimistic day. Wednesday, with the moon continuing in practical, conservative, organized Capricorn, it will be in harmony with communication discerning Mercury around 6 to 7 a.m. Pacific time. That could be very favorable for business meetings, for studying, for all forms of communications. By late afternoon Pacific time, the moon will be in harmony with progressive, futuristic Uranus. Now, the moon Uranus, you might get overly excited and, and try, be impulsive and try all kinds of new things. But the moon's in practical, sensible Capricorn. So this is actually very favorable for getting out of any dull routine without going over the top. Thursday, that moon in Capricorn is void, of course, again. Some weeks, there are basically no long void of course periods. This week, we have several. On Thursday, the moon in void of course, 7:14 a.m. to 1:42 p.m. Pacific time, when the moon leaves conservative Capricorn and then goes into futuristic, progressive, innovative Aquarius. But at 1:42 p.m., when the moon goes into 0 degrees of Aquarius, it's going to be crossing over Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius for that next hour or two. That can, the moon is these emotional responses, the public responses. Crossing over a Pluto could trigger some really intense emotional reactions. On the positive, this can be a strong need for meditation, for introspection, for research, for probing deep within. On Friday, as the moon continues in eclectic, futuristic Aquarius, Venus, creative, pleasure-seeking, and relational Venus will be making a square, a difficult transit to Saturn. Now, Venus to Saturn can hurt and test relationships, but is actually good for manifesting creative projects and can be favorable for getting more organized with your finances. But when it comes to personal relationships, because Venus is that planet of love, when it's hitting Saturn, it's time to be realistic, take responsibilities, don't run away from it. But it could also be indicating some real red flags if the relationship is on its way out the door. So you either have to start working on the relationship or realize it's time to let go of the relationship. Now, this could also be financial business relationships. The moon in Aquarius will be stressful to intelligent, rational Mercury around noon to 1 p.m. Pacific time. The moon is subjective in tension with Mercury, which is rational. This is not a good period in the day for having any kind of important discussions, especially if you're trying to resolve any personal conflicts, because there's one of you might be overly rational and the other might be overly emotional. So I would almost suggest you take a breather and sleep on it. Saturday, the moon continues in Aquarius. Aquarius seeks out personal freedom, but it's very favorable for hanging out with friends. Now, the moon will be void of course. As I said, it's quite a few void of courses this week, a time of a lot of just lying low, doing much more, staying the course. Saturday, the moon is void of course in Aquarius from 8:16 a.m. until 3:57 p.m. Pacific time, at which point, as we're going into the Saturday evening, the moon will be in Pisces. Now, Aquarius tends to be more impersonal on an emotional level, whereas Pisces is overly sensitive, empathetic, caring, but can get too involved emotionally. Sunday, the moon continues in Pisces. It will be in harmony with confident, assertive Mars from late morning, 11 a.m. into past 12 noon Pacific time. Now, that could be a favorable time for being very active physically or having more confidence to go on an adventure, go exercise. Mercury, when the moon is in harmony with Mercury, that's more around 4 or 5 p.m. Pacific time. Mercury is rational, the moon is emotional, but what's in harmony, this is very favorable for communications, creative writing, acting, singing as one examples. But for the non-performer, that moon Mercury can be very favorable for being empathetic and intuitive and really communicating on a heartfelt level. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope to see you next week with my next segment. Until then, be safe and well.